We all remember the big numbers about vaccine efficacy. 95%, 94%, they were everywhere. But what if the way those numbers were calculated and presented was kind of misleading? Today, we're going to break down a seminar by Professor Bronajari and his team of researchers that asks some pretty tough questions about the statistics we were all shown during the pandemic.
And this quote right here, it really gets to the heart of their argument. The claim isn't just that the information was a little bit off. They're saying it was often deficient, incomplete, and in some cases just plain statistically wrong. So let's unpack exactly what they mean by that. According to these researchers, the problem started from day one, with the very first numbers that hit the headlines. You know the one, that famous 95% efficacy figure? Well, they claim it only ever told part of the story.
To really get what they're critiquing, we have to understand a really crucial detail that the seminar points out. There isn't just one way to measure how well a vaccine works. Nope, there are two, and they tell very, very different stories.
Okay, so the number that we all saw, the one in all the headlines, was something called relative risk reduction, or RRR. Think of it this way. It only looks at the small group of people who are likely to get sick in the first place and tells you how effective the vaccine was for them. But the researchers in this seminar argue there's another, maybe more important number, absolute risk reduction, or ARR. Now this one looks at the entire population and tells you what the risk reduction is for any single person, whether they were likely to get sick or not. And this is really key if you want to understand the real-world impact of a massive vaccination campaign.
And here is where that distinction just becomes incredibly stark. Just look at this data they present. Pfizer's relative risk reduction, that's the headline number, was 95%. I mean, that sounds amazing, right? But its absolute risk reduction was just 0.84%. The seminar's point is that while one number makes it sound like you have near-perfect protection, the other suggests that for any random person in the population, the individual benefit was actually less than 1%.
So what does that really mean? Well, it brings us to this concept the paper highlights called the number needed to vaccinate. Based on the Pfizer trial data they analyzed, you would have needed to vaccinate 119 people just to prevent one single case of COVID-19. Now, this all leads us to what the seminar presents as one of its most powerful findings, a deep dive into a single methodological rule that they claim fundamentally twisted the data right from the get-go. The paper actually poses this pretty wild question and then explores it with a simulation. Their whole analysis here centers on a very specific rule about what you do with data from the first 2 weeks after someone gets a shot. So here's the rule they zero in on, which they say comes from a WHO guideline. For statistical purposes, if anyone had an infection or an adverse event within 14 days of their first dose, they were officially counted as unvaccinated. The seminar argues this is a massive flaw. Why? Because it means any bad outcome in that 2-week window, whether it's an infection or a side effect, got moved from the vaccinated column right over to the unvaccinated column. They argue this created a huge statistical bias. And this right here illustrates the alleged results just brilliantly. Researchers Fenton and Neal ran a simulation that the seminar cites, and it showed that this rule, all by itself, could make a completely useless placebo appear to be 86% effective in the first few weeks. And then, you see that effect just sort of wears off over time. And because this rule was apparently used in a lot of observational studies, the paper concludes that all the efficacy data coming out of those specific studies is, in their professional opinion, completely unreliable. Okay, so the analysis then makes a big shift. It moves away from efficacy and starts looking at safety, arguing that the ways we tracked adverse events were, well, just as flawed.
The seminar then takes a close look at how safety was tracked, focusing on Italy's drug agency, AIFA. They used what's called a passive surveillance system. All that means is the agency basically waits for a patient or their doctor to voluntarily file a report. The researchers claim this method is just notorious for underreporting, because the entire burden is on the individual to actually do something.
And the difference that this one choice makes, according to the paper's data, it is just staggering. While the passive system in Italy reported only 18 serious events per 100,000 doses, the active systems, where officials actually call and follow up with people, they were reporting numbers in the thousands or even tens of thousands. We are talking about a difference of several orders of magnitude here. It's huge. This critique even extends to how deaths were looked at. So out of 812 reported deaths after vaccination that AIFA reviewed, they concluded that only 3.6% were actually correlatable to the vaccine.
But the seminar questions this, arguing that deaths were very often just blamed on pre-existing conditions, even if that person's condition had been totally stable for years, right up until they got vaccinated.
So, what does this all add up to? Well, the researchers' final conclusion is that these examples aren't just a few isolated mistakes. They're arguing it's a consistent pattern of statistical choices and biases that all point in the same direction.
The authors of this paper basically contend that when you look at all the errors and statistical choices together, they all push the data in one direction, to inflate how effective the vaccines looked and to minimize how risky they appeared.
And this really brings us to the core of their entire argument, which is about the scientific process itself. The seminar contends that when authorities refuse to release the raw data so that independent researchers can check their work, well, as the quote says, it is not science. It's something else entirely.
Ultimately, this whole detailed statistical critique isn't just about the numbers. It's really about this question. The final point they leave us with is that in science and in public health, trust isn't just built on conclusions. It's built on transparency, on the ability for anyone to openly look at and verify the data that led to those conclusions in the first place.